two gentlemen, one nation, thousands of dead, hundred thousands of displaced persons who benefit from the crisis in Sudan. Today, we are going to talk to two academics. One, Dr. Faiza El Igzi, political scientist and advocate from the University of Queensland. Professor Peter Wood from Griffith University. With those two, we are going to discuss and know who really benefits from the crisis in Sudan. Welcome to the weekly retro. I am Jimmy Bin.
Okay, now I will start with you, Dr. Faiza. What is going on in Sudan?
Thank you, Jimmy. Thanks for the invitation and for the importance you're putting on, or the spotlight you're shining on Sudan. As you've said, since the 15th of April, there has been what conflict? I think we can call it more than conflict. There has been a war, an internal war in Sudan, and it's a war between what the media is calling two generals, between the leader or the president and the vice president of the Supreme Council in Sudan, the people who were trusted with the running of the country, and they have been fighting for supremacy as to who has the right to govern Sudan, which is an independent sovereign nation. The fighting has been going on now for almost 6 weeks. The latest reports say around 1,000 people have died, but these are, the official reports. People think that probably double or maybe three times that number of people, 4,000, have been injured to different types of injuries. And again, the numbers are much higher. The country has come to a standstill. Around 1 million people have been displaced, a quarter of a million to neighboring countries, Egypt, Chad, South Sudan, Ethiopia. Uh, Around 700 people have been displaced internally. The conflict currently, or the war, is concentrated in Khartoum, the greater Khartoum city, and in the western region of Darfur, which we have probably heard about in the past when there were the fighting with the Janjaweed and so on. So that has escalated again. The banking system has been significantly impacted, it's been disrupted. Energy, there is an energy crisis. People have no access to electricity, to water, or very limited access to electricity, to water, issues with food security. So basically, what people experience during time of war in their nation, Sudanese people in the north of Sudan are currently experiencing that, simply because there is a fight for power and supremacy in the land.
Uh, Dr. Professor Peter Wood, you have been a good friend to the African people, and you travel around the world, even in some African countries. Can you tell us do what do bring Sudanese to this point?
Well, there's a long history, of course, Jimmy, of unfortunately instability, and we can trace the roots of this conflict way back to the time of Bashir, who in 1989 took power, and then to shore up his support when he had a rebellion in Darfur. He unfortunately gave free rein to the Janjaweed, who then took, in exchange for their loyalty to Bashir, he gave them free rein to develop their reign of terror to the people of that region, and also Sudan, and also the people of South Sudan, and even neighboring countries as well. And unfortunately, as a result of giving this splinter group, the Janjaweed, power, it led to the rise of Hemeti, who is now you could say, the aggressor in this current conflict. It's hard to say who is the aggressor and who is the other side in this case, because both are really at loggerheads. But that instability has carried on, and by allowing a splinter group to obtain political power, it has, and also giving the army access to economic resources as well, their own way of raising resources, etc. These two power groups were loyal to Bashir for many years, but of course, during the People's Revolution in 2019, the two groups chose to put their lot in with the civilian protesters and to topple Bashir. And as a result of this, these two groups, well, they're really three groups, including the more civilian led by the Prime Minister, these three groups have been trying to form some kind of alliance and trying to lead the country towards democratic reforms through the Sovereign Council. But of course, there's been so many attacks on the civilian administration, assassination attempts and others. And of course, it came to a loggerheads when over an issue, which, of course, there's many issues, but one main issue was the issue of the transition of the RSF into the main army. And on one side, the army said that would take 2 years. And then Hemeti and his group, the RSF, said it would take 10 years. And that was one of the key points of disagreement. And then, of course, they're now seeking to obtain power. Hemeti, of course, realizes that once the RSF is absorbed into the army, that he will have no easily controlled force under his command. So I guess these are some of the issues that have led to this, the political part of this conflict. And it's a very sad situation for the people who are caught in the middle. It's hard to even call it a civil war because there's really very little involved of the civilian groups. It's really two armed groups that are fighting it out, in starting with Khartoum, but then extending, of course, out to Darfur and other regions of the country. Back to you, Jimmy.
So, Dr. Faiza, I know that al-Bashir used to be a dictator in Sudan. And if al-Bashir was kicked out, that means the Sudanese wanted democracy. Do you think that Sudan was ready for democracy?
That's a very interesting question, Jimmy. If you look at the history of Sudan since independence in 1956, that's almost like 70 years since independence. We only had a total of 10 years of civil rule, which you could call democracy, where we had an election. I was born in Sudan, and I spent the first 25 years of my life in Sudan. Over those 25 years, I only voted once. So since coming to Australia, I have voted, to elect leaders for the government more than I have in my 25 years in Sudan. So if you look at that history, whenever Sudan gets into a short period of democracy, it's toppled by the army. And part of that problem is the politicization of the army. The army is supposed to be there as a resource for the government, for defending of the people of the land against external aggressors and so on. But the problem of Sudan is that the people in the army have also been politicized and have been used as a tool or a mechanism to topple, if I could say, democratically elected government. So the first uh, the first coup happened with the support of the left wing political groups, because they were not happy with the outcome of the election. The second Nimeri came in as a result of that. Al-Bashir came in as a result of the army siding, or not necessarily the army siding, with the Islamic movement, but the Islamic movement infiltrating, enabling the army to topple an existing civil, democratically elected government. And so al-Bashir stayed for 30 years. This situation now is different, but is almost the same, because during the 30-year regime of al-Bashir, who, as you said initially, is a dictator, the Islamic Brotherhood has infiltrated the system so much so that people started talking about, the deep state. They have taken over commerce, industry, ministries, and so on. So when the al-Bashir regime was toppled, these elements or these groups of people were sitting on the periphery. And it was just for me a matter of time before they could come back again. And we were holding our breaths for the first, what was it, 2019 till 2011, a couple of years where we had shared governance between the three groups that Peter talked about, which is the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces. I call them a militia, the army that supported the civilians in toppling al-Bashir, and not a democratically elected, but a representation of civil society in Hamduk, who were there trying to oversee um, a process of handing over the governance of the country to the civilians. And it was a process that other nations in the Middle East were watching with interest and admiration, unfortunately, until November 2022, which was just a few months ago, where the army, sensing that the time has come for it to be removed from the Sovereign Council, they intervened and removed the civil aspect, or the civilian arm of that process, and ended up with the military and the Rapid Support Force, a militia. I continue to call them a militia. And it was just a matter of time before these two groups ended up in conflict with each other. Is Sudan ready? I think Sudan is ready. If you look at independence in Sudan was negotiated with the British as a colonizing force. It wasn't fought in the same way that it happened in Algeria or in Egypt or in other Middle Eastern countries. So it shows that the Sudanese people really respect sitting down and negotiating, and that is the heart of having a democratic government. But once it comes to translating the principles to reality, it seems that people who lose to the democratic system don't have the capacity to sit and wait for their term to come. And that lack of patience is probably the problem of the Sudanese people.
Lack of patience. So, Prof. Peter, yes, we have heard that Sudan is a democratic country, but the crisis, can you tell us who do you think is benefiting from that crisis?
Unfortunately, almost no one is benefiting. The only ones who are benefiting are the two warring factions. They are trying to obtain supremacy over each other, but in the process, they are destroying each other as well. If we look economically, the country is suffering and has been suffering a downturn since 2018 in terms of GDP. And in terms of the food insecurity, it's been now occurring for many years, which is a great shame considering the potential fertility of the country. And it's also, the Sudanese people are one of the more educated groups in the region. Universities in Khartoum are quite broadly respected. And, the rich history and rich culture of the country and even the strength of religion has really been the strength of the people. But all of these are under attack by people who have very selfish interests at heart. So the only people who are benefiting are those, you could say that some of the foreign powers that are receiving gold and other resources from Sudan are also benefiting, that they have been also been supporting the RSF through purchasing what they have mined and what they have stolen really from the people, and that they have benefited. And some of the RSF fighters have gone to fight in Yemen and the surrounding region, the surrounding instability in Sudan has also, you could say, the export of these sort of revolutionaries, well, not revolutionaries, but the RSF, that these groups have benefited from that. So, and some of those countries should really be playing a part in the solutions rather than adding to the conflict by supplying arms. Of course, now we've also learned that the Wagner Group has some influence as well, and that by obtaining gold, they're also supplying arms to the warring groups. So you could say that external actors are benefiting. In some cases, these are nations, these are countries, which really should be acting more responsibly in terms of reducing their export of arms and looking to support the efforts of the civilians. And the brave people here, of course, are the people in the streets who've been protesting and have been taking the courage to say that we don't want military rule anymore. They're the ones that started the transition of power. And it didn't start in Khartoum, it started outside of Khartoum. And so the whole country, you could say, there's a significant number of people in the country who are really looking for a transition back to a democratic democratic process. So unfortunately, the only ones who are benefiting are those who are the aggressors, the combatants in this war. But even they're in the eyes of the world and in the eyes of the people, I believe that whatever respect people had for them is rapidly diminishing.
Just with you, Professor Peter.
Sorry, Jimmy. Before you continue, I just want to add to that point. I totally agree with you, Peter, on this point. But I also just want to add the implications of what is happening in Sudan regionally is quite significant. And we're currently seeing the flow of people to neighboring countries. I mean, as I started at the beginning, the number of people who fled to Egypt is probably now around 30,000 people. Egypt has its own, Egypt is a very densely populated area. Its economy is not the best at this point in time, and the sudden influx of people at this point in time is adding pressure to the economy. Chad, on the other side, is also a country that has got issues with economic development, food security. South of Sudan is dealing with its own development issues, economy, governance, and so on. And there are around 70,000 South Sudanese people who used to live in the north, and all these now are migrating back to south of Sudan, going as refugees. On the eastern side, the Horn of Africa, you've got the problem with Tigray, and that border is already quite fragile. And now you've got movements of people in the thousands going that way. On top of this, Sudan was home to around 1 million displaced people, from Tigray, from Syria, from other countries. And so these people are now again ending up in a situation where they have to seek refuge somewhere else. So the impact on the region, just in terms of people's movement, is quite critical. Some political analysts are saying that if this conflict continues to the near future, then we can see further movements of groups of people like Al-Shabaab or Boko Haram being attracted to the chaos that's happening and to the free flow of arms and so on, and further destabilizing the region, further creating, intensifying the movement of people as refugees from the African continent to other areas through the Mediterranean, to Europe, and so on. So the implications long term for the region and globally are quite significant. So I totally agree that apart from arms dealers and people who benefit from chaos, no one else is benefiting from this war. In fact, the negative impact is much more greater than we anticipate.
This question goes to you, Professor Peter. Uh, when we remember about the Taliban in Afghanistan, we saw the West motivated. They sent troops, and the Afghans were evacuated. They were even taken to Western countries. Why does the same international, the same West, no longer motivated to do what they did in Afghanistan, to do the same in Sudan?
In terms of international intervention, you mean, Jimmy?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because we saw many Afghans went to Canada, were taken to USA, others even to Africa, I think in Rwanda. So why not the Sudanese?
And indeed, Jimmy, we could say that about Ukraine. That now currently the Ukraine conflict, which is a great tragedy. The exodus of refugees has been welcomed by many countries. No, not welcomed, but at least there has been a welcome mat extended and opportunities for temporary location and migration. Whereas the same is not being extended to Sudan. And in fact, here in Australia, there are many groups, including the Refugee Council, who have banded together to write to Minister Wong and to make representation to say there are many things that could be done to assist people who are suffering under the current situation, family members and others. In fact, I encourage you to look at the letter sent by the Refugee Council, one of many, in terms of the kind of things that could be done to assist. So the answer why is one, I guess, of Sudan, not being in the spotlight. There is difficulties in reporting, but again, we can only say that sometimes when these conflicts occur in Africa, that there is not, for reasons which I would say include racism, there is this sense of not valuing people's lives. And I think if we look in terms of the civilians who are suffering right now, it's really exceeding what is occurring in Ukraine because of the, one thing just to add to what the doctor was sharing before is the medical crises, people who have been most of the hospitals in Khartoum, of course, are not operating. Medications are not around. People who are on dialysis can't receive treatment. People who just need drugs to survive. And although there are humanitarian efforts at the border and in other places to assist people, the instability in the region is making it difficult to really get help to where people need it. And I guess one reason, and I don't want to make excuses for any international bodies, so we're not international other countries, but I guess one reason is that there doesn't seem to be any simple solution in sight at the moment. These two groups are basically going to fight it out until either one gains the advantage over the other, or until they are willing to accept that change needs to happen, because for both of them, this will result in their diminishment of power, because they're, even the army, its main job is to secure the security of the company from external actors, and in an emergency, the internal stability of the country, they have failed absolutely. And the RSF, claiming that they're supporting the change to civilian rule is just ridiculous. And so they really have no legitimacy in terms of where they are coming from. So I guess in answer, Jimmy, there has not the connection in Afghanistan was because the action in Afghanistan was because of the attacks on the World Trade Center and the events of 9/11. And so that affected directly the United States. And so there was the war on terror declared. In this case, there is no direct effect on any of the major powers in the same way that 9/11 occurred. And so the emphasis on bringing an intervention and an international stabilization force has not been very strong at this point. I guess there are stages in the conflict that are to come, and hopefully there will be some kind of stabilization force that will be involved in the future to help the country settle. We've seen that in South Sudan, the international stabilization force has been there for some time, and it's been a real struggle to get that country to elections. And similarly, I think it will be a similar struggle in Sudan. Although we can say that in Sudan there is a much stronger movement of people, civilian protests and others, a much stronger cadre of potential politicians who'll be able to take the rule of the country, to take the democratic background and traditions of the country forward, and to help the country move forward, as compared to South Sudan, where essentially you still have a revolutionary government in power. Over to you, Jimmy.
Dr. Faisal, what steps are needed now?
Steps as in for the country. So this is actually a really difficult question. For me, the urgency is what the Jeddah negotiations are trying to achieve at this point in time. A cessation of hostilities, a cessation of fire, so that humanitarian aid, medical supplies can be brought to the people who have been, over the past 6 weeks, really hurting. And Peter talks about the impact, the health impact on people. I myself have got maybe 3 members of my extended family lose their lives because of lack of medical attention. One to dialysis, one to cancer treatment, and another friend of the family was so overwhelmed by what has happened, they had a heart attack. So these are, just me, 3 people in my network have lost their lives over the past 6 weeks as a direct and indirect impact of what's happening. I call my family every night to check in on them. They struggle with food security. They are on 1 meal a day, and that's probably not a full meal. It's something to eat. They are surviving, not living. They are surviving, um, and it's becoming increasingly difficult. So I think the first step is for the negotiations in Jeddah to bear fruit. The two warring parties, the military and the RSF, have intervention to around 8 times, where they agreed to cessation of hostilities so humanitarian supplies can be delivered to people, and they have not. And I repeat, they have not respected, the promises they made. We're still waiting for that to happen. That's the first one, and the second one is for them to build trust so that we can believe that what they say is what it's going to happen. I personally do not feel optimistic, simply because the track record of these two groups in terms of negotiation over the past 6 weeks has not been promising. I do not think that either of them will concede to the other, and that this conflict will deepen, will expand, and will become more complex and more protracted. And negotiations can only happen when one of them realizes that they don't have the resources. One of the things that Al Burhan has done that could potentially elevate the military is they have frozen the bank accounts and the supplies of funding to the RSF. That might have long-term impact, but it's not necessarily going to have an impact straight away. And so it's weakening two giants. It's a death of one of them by 1,000 cuts rather than an immediate cessation of hostilities and a return of the people back to Sudan. I think uh, in the long run, if the country comes to a standstill and the hostilities and the war stops, then there has to be quite a serious conversation globally as to how to support this country or to help this country rebuild itself, because the infrastructure, economic infrastructure, the social infrastructure, the health infrastructure has been decimated. It was already um, reeling, not operating properly, and now it has been decimated, the looting, the bombing. So the country is going to take maybe another decade for it to get to a point where we can have hope that it will progress. So, not a positive outcome for me in terms of steps.
So, Prof, if you are maybe contacted by the government, the Australian government, to get a piece of advice from you, what Australians and its partners should be doing in response to this crisis in Sudan?
Mm.
What advice can you?
Yes, I think that, Jimmy, I think that in terms of playing a role in resolving the actual conflict, there's probably very little that Australia can do. Australia doesn't necessarily have a strong representation, or, well, there's the embassy in Egypt, but Australia doesn't necessarily have a place at the table for helping to resolve some of these issues. However, where Australia can play a role is in the humanitarian and in terms of supporting its own citizens and the families and the people from Sudan who are in the country right now. So there's a few things. One thing is for the Australian government to those people who are from Sudan on temporary visas to have a more substantial visa system where they can also access the resources that they need in terms of Medicare and other resources in order for them to stay in the country and to be supported while they're here. The second is for all of those visas that are currently being processed to be processed quickly as a priority, so that those the visas can be issued, and people, once they do make it out of to the borders or out of the country directly, that they can come to Australia. And there are still many pending visa applications right now. So there's two things that they could do. Another thing, that although the Australian government has provided $6 million in humanitarian effort, $1 million to go to the Red Cross, and then the rest to go to various agencies, that's really a drop in the bucket when you compare with the kind of resources that we've provided for Ukraine, for example, where we provided the Bushmaster vehicles, and they're rebuilding those Bushmaster vehicles, the ones that from the Australian government, and the costs there I saw of rebuilding, replacing those Bushmaster vehicles is over $100 million. So $6 million is just a drop in the bucket. And I think for any, the other aspects are those people who had refugee claims as well. There were people from Sudan who had refugee claims. They need to be reassessed in view of the fact that they can't return. They fit perfectly within the definition of the UNHCR's definition of refugees. So that needs to be addressed fairly quickly and fairly urgently. And yes, to include Sudanese nationals as a priority group in the refugee and humanitarian program to enable fast processing of visas. There's a number of things that the Australian government could do now, but we're a little bit slow off the mark. And I think many of these things will come to pass, but it just shows overall, and unfortunately the last budget reinforced this, position of those who are applying for asylum in this country, that we're just not treating people fairly, and not really fulfilling our obligations under the UNHCR obligations. So we need to do more, and the Australian government is in a position to help many people if only they would open their hearts and open the government coffers to assist in this process. Other than that, I guess on the diplomatic front, there is always representations that can be made, and I think that there needs to be a concerted effort from governments around the region, and not just the region, because the trading partners of Sudan include Macau, for example, Macau in People's Republic of China. Those major trading partners need to take a stand and not trade with these military groups, and provide in order to starve them of funds. And so these are international activities that could be undertaken. It needs to have a higher priority in the United Nations as well. Australia should play a part in supporting the efforts of the UN. Australia doesn't play a part in the African Union, but obviously the African Union needs to continue to take efforts to help resolve the crisis. Back to you, Jimmy.
Dr. Faiza.
Look, I totally agree with what Peter said, and I concur with him that all these are really relevant and really important points that he mentioned. I want to add one last point, and it's something that Australia could, initiate a lot of noise about. War is gender. Women suffer more significantly in war. Gender violence, sexual gender violence is happening currently in Sudan, and is an instrument of war. And over the last 2-3 weeks, we have started hearing more and more stories of sexual violence against women. So I think one of the things that Australia could start doing is to lobby internationally for the international community to condemn this heinous aspect of war. It's not just about the killing and the looting and the curtailing of people's freedom. It's this extra aspect of it. Currently in Sudan, a lot of people who are staying behind are probably women and children, older women and children and they suffer significantly in times of conflict, regardless of what that conflict is about. Um, we go back to medical attention. I think there was there were statistics about thousands of women giving birth or ready to give birth or in the process of giving birth over this period of time, not having access to medical attention, the potential of loss of life, infections, um, long-term implications for the children. These are quite serious things that we don't think about when we're talking about war, but the gendered face of violence of war needs to be considered, and Australia could, as part of its commitment to addressing violence against women, could start talking about that publicly and globally. Over to you, Jimmy.
Thank you, viewers. You have been watching the Retro. And today, our guests were Dr. Faiza, who is a political scientist and social advocate. We also had the privilege to host Professor Peter Wood, who is the associate professor at Griffith University in Queensland. So it has been a pleasure to be with them, and they accepted to join us today. So, last question to you, Dr. Faiza. If you were asked to address the two leaders in Sudan, what would you tell them?
Settle down, boys. You know, you're both Sudanese. What you're doing is really impacting the Sudanese community. So let's put down our weapons, let's sit down, let's talk this through. As Sudanese people usually do, let's sit down, talk about it, stop the fighting. Basically, stop the fighting. Um, I think the lack of um, holding people to account, we've seen that in Darfur. Um, the lack of holding people to account for what they do um, is encouraging what's happening now. And so we probably need to start thinking of how we can hold these two individuals to account sometime in the future. Al Bashir is wanted by the International Criminal Court, but he is no longer in jail in Sudan, and nobody knows where he is now. So, again, that impunity and the lack of holding people to account can make it very difficult. Asking them to stop the war probably won't make them. And so I am at a loss.
Viewers, it has been an honor to host these two academics today. Please keep sending us your views or questions to JBINRUMA, or send us a WhatsApp message to +61 424 875 170. Until we meet next time, Masalama.